Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the Unfolding Restoration. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm so excited to be with you today. I hope you love and are benefited and edified by this video, where in this series of videos, what I'm striving to do is to just present and help us see a little bit how the restoration unfolds, line upon line and precept upon precept. This video, number 15, is a little bit of an extension of video 14, where I talked about the school of the prophets, and the endowment, the presentation of the endowment in the Kirtland Temple. If you haven't yet watched that video, I might recommend that you do so, because it will help contextualize some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video, focusing in on the word of wisdom as a whole. I hate to burst your bubble. I'm not going to sit here and give a stereotypical word of wisdom lesson. And I don't mean that to be pejorative or condescending. I don't want to sit there and tell you whether, this herbal tea or mate or getting into how much meat is too much meat is in excess, and times of winter and hunger and famine. I will leave that up to you in your own personal decision and agency to judge those things. I want to talk about broader principles, particularly in the context of the school of the prophets and the history of what's going on here, to maybe help you as you make your own decisions to work with God through your own agency, to know how to apply and live the word of wisdom. Something that is fundamental to, has become fundamental to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a very defining thing for us. So one of the reasons why I want to take this approach with you is because to understand the word of wisdom, hopefully, maybe in a way that often isn't presented, I like when Joseph Smith says that he has a key by which he understands the parables of Jesus. He says, the key is, I ask myself, what was the question that drew the parable? Well, I actually have a key, using Joseph's teaching there, I have a key by which I understand the revelations of Joseph Smith. The key I ask myself is, what was the circumstance that drew the revelation? Or what was the context that drew the revelation? That's really important with the word of wisdom, because the word of wisdom comes in the context of the school of the prophets. That's why I told you to watch the previous video. Joseph is trying to help a group of people to achieve endowment, to learn how to become sanctified and pure and holy, and to come into the presence of God. The thing on Joseph Smith's mind is not, how can I make people more healthy? The thing on Joseph Smith's mind is, how can I make people more holy? And if we understand that, we'll start to unlock and have a key to grasp what the word of wisdom might be getting at. Now, don't get me wrong either. Part of the blessings and the promises of the word of wisdom are health in our navel, and that we'll be able to run and not be weary and walk and not faint. There are physical blessings from the word of wisdom, but we cannot only focus on the physical. If the word of wisdom were merely about health, it would have somewhere in the verses, thou shalt do cardio 5 days a week, that thou shalt refrain from excessive refined sugars, thou shalt strengthen the core. But those verses are not in there. There's some basic verses of abstain from these things and eat these things, but that's about it. And I'll talk a little bit about with the what we're to abstain from, why those things might be present, and what we're supposed to eat as a whole. But I want you to grasp that higher idea that this is a holiness code, not just a health code. If we remember that, and remember the sanctification that they're seeking for, we grasp its purpose better. Its purpose is to help us as we try to achieve endowment as a whole. So in that way, it's appropriate that the word of wisdom later, much, much later, will be tied to the temple. And speaking of much, much later, I want to kick off a little bit first by talking about that. We also have to be really careful with the word of wisdom that we don't interpret it through our modern lens, through today's standards of how we see the church. The word of wisdom has become so ubiquitous and synonymous with faithfulness. I mean, it's part of our temple recommend questions. We can't go into the temple without obeying the word of wisdom, that we assume that it was always like that. A common thing that's brought up in academic circles is this idea of presentism. Presentism means that we uncritically adhere to the present day attitudes or the values of modern times and place them automatically on the people of the past. Well, let's not do that with the word of wisdom. The reason why is because the early saints did not view the word of wisdom the same way you and I do. To help you and I grasp how the early saints might have viewed the word of wisdom, let me ask you a question. How's your food storage coming? How's your personal preparation with food storage and saving and getting temporal things saved up going? Well, I don't know, of the thousands of people that might watch this video, some of you probably go like, hey, really well, particularly given our last year with COVID and some of the societal unrest that many of us have been through. Some of you might be saying, yeah, I'm good. Others might be like, I'm not so good. I've got a little bit of money saved up, but not much. I don't have much, if any, food. And maybe you're thinking, I should do better with that. The reason why I share that example is because your same mentality with food storage is the way that the early church viewed the word of wisdom. Yes, there are lots of I could show you scores of prophetic teachings, official things from the church that we should save up and store and be prepared. But it's not a defining marker of faithfulness. It's not something that defines whether somebody's a covenant keeper or not. And in the early church, even though we have different statements from various leaders encouraging people to obey the word of wisdom, it's going to take about 100 years for the word of wisdom to become a commandment for the church. And I'll show little by little how that progression happens. But the reason why I say this is important is because you will find examples of pioneers crossing the plains and Brigham telling them to take coffee and tea. You will find examples of Brigham Young smoking peace pipes with Native Americans when they arrive in the Salt Lake Valley. You'll find examples of Joseph Smith drinking beer. It's right there in his journal. Here's one right out of his journal on the 1st of June, 1844, a decade after the word of wisdom is revealed. Saturday, June 1st, 1844, at home, some gentle showers, 1 p.m. Rode out with Dr. Will Richards and O.P. Porter Rockwell. Called on Daniel Davis, met George Adams, paid him $50. To John P. Green, now look at the end. Exchanged $100 gold for check, drank a glass of beer at Frederick Mosier's. Now, that doesn't mean that Joseph was being wicked and rebelling. They're just not seeing that as contrary to some binding commandment that they have to keep. It would be akin to you saying, yeah, I don't quite have my food storage ready. So with that, the word of wisdom even kicks off by showing that it was not considered a commandment for them. If you look at verse 1 through 3 of section 89, it starts by saying that this is not meant to be a commandment. Verse 1 to 3 is an introduction, and in verse 2, to be sent by greeting, not by commandment or constraint. Not by commandment or constraint. So when did it go from not being commandment to being commandment and constraint? Well, there's some indications early on that they took the word of wisdom seriously. Joseph Smith one time refused to give a priesthood office holder, he refused to let him act in his office if he refused to strive to comply with the word of wisdom. In 1851, when we do get to the valley, by the way, Brigham Young will ask for and receive a sustaining vote that we should commit to live the word of wisdom. He says, all the boys under 90 years of age, I like to joke that some 95-year-old was like, yes. But there was still some confusion. In 1880, decades later, George Q. Cannon publicly teaches that it's not a commandment. It's just kind and wise counsel that we should commit to. And in all fairness, Brigham Young would struggle with it. He'd commit to not using tobacco, but then every now and then go back to it. Even in 1883, John Taylor emphasized with the Quorum of the 12 their need to more fully live the word of wisdom. And he says, quote, as we all more or less have been negligent upon that point. That's in late 1880s. In 1894, it's starting to grow a little bit, and Heber J. Grant and Joseph F. Smith, after a talk by Brigham Young Jr., by the way, who says, do you remember my father decades ago said that we should live this? Saying that it should be a commandment. They both confirm that it's a commandment for the saints. So this is at the very end of the 1800s, as we're getting ready to move in the 1900s. In 1901, President Joseph F. Smith began withholding temple recommends from repeat offenders of the word of wisdom. But he still had some leniency for older saints. And when Heber J. Grant becomes president of the church in 1918, it starts to become a standing practice to only issue temple recommends to those who will obey in the word of wisdom. By the time Heber J. Grant dies in 1945, it's accepted as a standard practice for all faithful saints. By the way, it's not coincidental, in my opinion, either, that the word of wisdom becoming a binding expected commandment for the church also coincides at the same time of prohibition in the United States of America. And this chart right here that you can see, this is a chart, a histogram showing how many times normalized, the data is normalized here, how many times the word of wisdom has been mentioned by decade. And you can see in the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s in particular, it received a real heavy emphasis as it became this binding commandment. It's such a binding commandment that today that we will not baptize people into the church unless they commit to living the word of wisdom. And obviously, it's one of the temple recommend questions. One of the temple recommend questions now is, do you understand and obey the word of wisdom? That understand was added in there. And I hope this video is helping and will help in grasping with some understanding. So let's talk a little bit about what the Revelation is saying as a whole. I want you to understand that the word of wisdom is future looking. I just talked about how it took 100 years. It is one of those unique revelations where the Lord says in verse 4, because of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men, I have warned you and forewarn you by giving you this word of wisdom. Now, us today, we can see the wisdom in that. We can see tobacco companies manipulating data and marketing and trying to make things addictive. We need to be wise still to understand that there are yet things today or in the future that pertain to the items that are specifically discussed in the word of wisdom, or other things that prophets may warn against and forewarn against, that we need to be wise, that conspiring men continue in various ways today. It's not just a tobacco industry thing. There's other ways. In verse 5 to 9, it specifically gives some no's, things to avoid. In verse 5, it says to avoid wine and strong drink that would likely be interpreted as hard liquors like whiskeys and rums. That those are not good in the sight of God, and that wine should only be for your sacraments. And by the way, the early church for decades and decades will use wine for the sacrament. In verse 7, again, strong drinks it emphasizes. In verse 8, tobacco, to stay away from tobacco. And in verse 9, hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. Joseph Smith is reported as defining hot drinks as saying, quote, I understand that some of the people are excusing themselves in using tea and coffee because the Lord only said hot drinks in the revelation on the word of wisdom. Tea and coffee are what the Lord meant when he said hot drinks. And modern prophets, seers, and revelators have repeatedly clarified on tea what tea means and what coffee means. I'm not going to go into that in this video with you. Prophets have also added some things that are not in here. This is from True to the Faith, quote, anything harmful that people purposely take into their bodies is not in harmony with the word of wisdom. This is especially true of illegal drugs, which can destroy those who become addicted to them. Stay entirely away from them. Do not experiment with them. The abuse of prescription drugs also leads to destructive addiction. So they've added drug abuse in there through statements like that. Nor should members use harmful or habit-forming substances except under the care of a competent physician. So they do add that clarification in there as well. There are some do's. We cannot overlook the do's. Now, it's interesting that it took 100 years for the don'ts to become cemented. And primarily, by the way, when we ask if we live the word of wisdom, we think of the don'ts. Who knows? Maybe it will take another 100 years for us to really start grasping the do's that are in there as well. Verse 10 to 17. Verse 10 says that we should eat wholesome herbs. In verse 11, fruits in their season with prudence and thanksgiving. That flesh of beasts and fowls of the air should be used sparingly and with thanksgiving, particularly in times of cold and famine, in verse 15 there. Verse 14 to 17, all grain is good, and is the staff of life. So those are just some basics, and I understand that I'm not going into detail on those purposely. I do not want to try to establish some mark that the church itself does not establish. That's the reason why I'm not trying to push or define here for you. You and I need to use these teachings from prophets and Scripture and make our own decisions. But then we also need to be careful about not imposing things that are not stated as general standards for the church. Let's not create general standards for other people. That's why I don't want to do that here or for you. So what I want to get back to with you as the revelation ends, so we have the introduction, the don'ts, the do's, and then there's some promises at the end. A general principle of the word of wisdom, again, it's coming in the context of endowment, is trying to teach us how to live a life that is disciplined, how to live a life that is avoiding harmful addictions that take control of our life, how to live a life so that we have clarity of mind and so that we don't have impaired judgment as a whole. Maybe right here it's appropriate to tell you a personal story. I one time was attending an academic conference out in the South of the United States of America. In the South, they drink a lot of iced tea, a good sweet tea. We sat down for a lunch at this academic convention. There's literally thousands of professors and PhD holders there. And I sat down and I had on a BYU shirt. And I sat at a table with, I think there was 10 people seated at these round tables. And I didn't know the people, they didn't know me. And we start chatting and making small talk. And they see the Y on my shirt and they say, "Oh, are you from Yale?" And I said, "No, that Y's Brigham Young University." And you know the next question. They said, "Oh, are you a Mormon?" And I said, "No, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter." No, I didn't say that. I said, "Yes, I am." And what was interesting is, as the discussion started, everybody had already been served their sweet tea, and there's sweet tea and water sitting on or iced tea on the table. And I wasn't drinking mine. I was only drinking the water. And right after I said, "I'm a Mormon," somebody said, "Is that why you're not drinking your tea? Do Mormons not drink tea?" And I said, "Yeah, we don't. As part of our faith, we don't drink tea." And you know the next question. They said, "Why? Why?" And it's interesting, the whole table turned and started looking and talking with me. And I had a fascinating discussion with them. Now, the reason why I share that with you, if I had tried to frame, and this is where sometimes we dig ourselves into holes a little bit or paint ourselves into corners. If I had tried to only frame the word of wisdom as a health thing, well, then with a bunch of academics, we would have got into spinning different health studies. Well, one health study shows that a little bit of wine every day is good for you. This health study shows that coffee can do these things for your nerves. This health study shows that tea, we didn't get into that though. And I'm glad we didn't. All I said to them was something like this, as best I can recollect. I said, our founding prophet, Joseph Smith, we believed he received revelation from God, trying to help us learn how to develop self-discipline and to learn how to set us apart from the world or from common things that are in society. And I said, so we don't drink things like tea or coffee. We don't drink alcohol. We also don't smoke or chew tobacco. And I said, and those things are just common everywhere in society. And the reason why we don't drink them or consume them is because we believe that they help us to develop self-discipline. They help us to show that we are dedicated to God, that we're willing to choose Him over other common things in the world. And we believe that if we show that sort of dedication and discipline to God, that it will bless us in our spiritual lives and that God will bless us with His Spirit. And when I said that, or something like that, as best as I can recollect, that's not word for word, and when I said something like that, the people next to me said, "Oh, that makes sense. I appreciate you explaining that." And we had a great interaction. So the reason why I share that story is so that we can see the word of wisdom, hopefully in that broader context of Joseph trying to help the members of the school of the prophets to achieve endowment. Yes, I know historically there was the temperance movement. Joseph had seen the effects of hard whiskey. He had seen drunkenness, and so had people in his society. That surely was on his mind. But the major thing on his mind was, how do I help people to become dedicated to God, disciplined, sanctified, pure? And this was a revelation that would help in that. It would help them physically. That is definitely part of it. So let's conclude by looking at these blessings in verses 18 to 21. What I want you to notice in these blessings is that one blessing will be physical, but then another blessing will be spiritual. Physical, spiritual. Look at verse 18. All saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments. Again, obedience, learning these things. Shall receive health in their navel and marrow in their bones. Health, physical. Now spiritual, 19. And shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures, the things of God, spiritual. Back to physical in 20. And shall run and not be weary, and shall walk and not faint. And now spiritual. And I, the Lord, give unto them a promise, verse 21, that the destroying angel shall pass by them as the children of Israel and not slay them. Amen. I want to end on that last line. It's curious. Is the destroying angel an evil angel, or is it an angel from God? It seems to be sent from God. And it's likely hearkening, that phrase is hearkening to Moses and the children of Israel in Egypt. Remember, how were they designated as covenant Israel, as the children of Israel? Well, they took a lamb, shed its blood, marked it on the lintel and posts of the door, and the destroying angel passed by them because they recognized them as, oh, those are God's children. Therefore, they'll be saved. That's God's Israel. The word of wisdom, I want you to understand this, acts to mark us as covenant Israel. It is one of the outward indicators, just like blood on a doorpost. Coffee, tea, alcohol, tobacco, those things are ubiquitous in every society. I don't care where we go on this beautiful earth. Whatever society we're in, those things will be common. So the moment we say, I don't drink coffee or tea, I don't consume alcohol or tobacco, it marks us as peculiar. It marks us as a little different. It marks us as somebody who is set apart from the world. Now, I'm no medical physician. I trust doctors. I trust academics. I trust all those things that are out there. But I really trust God and what He has revealed on this. I don't know, by the way, if coffee or tea is or isn't ultimately good or bad for your body. But I do know that if God, and just like how I don't know with Moses, the Lord said, don't eat shellfish. Don't eat shrimp. Don't eat pork, things from pigs. Today we eat pork and we eat shrimp and shellfish. Does that mean that we're wicked or harming our bodies or unclean, to use a Mosaic term? No, because that's not part of the law. God seems to have chosen some common things in our society to make it part of His law to say, will you set yourself apart from that? And that if you and I will set ourselves apart from that, God will mark us as covenant Israel. I end this video by sharing my testimony that the word of wisdom will not only bless you and me physically, because God has marked it to bless us physically and spiritually, but it'll bless us spiritually too. And not only will help us be healthier, which I believe, but it will also, more importantly, perhaps, help us be holier. And not only will help us to enjoy a better life, clarity of mind, a lack of addictive substances, but it'll also help us to enjoy endowment, where we know because of our covenant commitment, our discipline to God, our rejection of the things of the world, how to come into His presence and have His power with us in our daily life. God bless you and God bless me as we strive our very best to live these wonderful divine teachings and revelations that unfolded to Joseph Smith line upon line and precept upon precept in the unfolding restoration.